Hello, bonjour. Welcome everybody to this first in a two-part speakers series presented in partnership by CPRA and FPT Park. This one is entitled Emerging from the Pandemic, Prioritizing Physical Activity and Recreation. My name is Mike Roma, and I'm the current chair of the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. And on behalf of the board, I just want to welcome everybody and welcome all of our panelists to this session. I want to start off by respectfully acknowledging that I'm located on Treaty 6 territory, and more specifically in an area that was known as the Beaver Hills House, the traditional territory of the Cree peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. That's where I'm at. I also want to acknowledge that the CPRA head office is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Mohawk First Nations. I'm thankful for the land that I call home and for what it does for me and my family every day. I'm humbled by my understanding of how we've all come to enjoy it, and I'm committed to finding ways that public recreation and parks can catalyze reconciliation. Also, how we can all learn from the traditional knowledge of Canada's Indigenous peoples to make a better future for us all. If you're not familiar with CPRA, we are a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy across Canada. We've been around for over 60 years. We consider ourselves three different things. The first is a voice, the second is a community, and the third is a resource. Our board is made up of 13 provincial and territorial associations, and collectively we represent over 90% of municipalities across Canada. We're very proud of the leadership that we provide the recreation and parks sector pre and during, I guess, the pandemic. And we're very proud of things like the Framework for Recreation in Canada, Parks for All, and Reimagine Rec, which we've been able to deliver in partnership with a number of organizations, including Sport Canada. We're also very proud of our relationship with the Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Physical Activity and Recreation Committee. And obviously that partnership's what's delivering this session today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Catherine Dorowa, who works at the Public Health Agency of Canada and Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Equity as the manager of the Federal, Provincial, Territorial Engagement Team. She's the federal co-chair of the FPT Park Committee and serves as a director of the Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation Council. Catherine?
Thank you, Mike. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first of the two-part speaker series for federal, provincial, and territorial government officials. Je vous remercie de vous être joindre à nous pour assister à cette première partie de la série de conférences dirigées aux représentants gouvernementaux. The FPT Physical Activity and Recreation Committee, or PARC for short, is really pleased to be collaborating with the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association on this speaker series. This is part of a broader knowledge transfer initiative that includes a webinar series for non-governmental sector. Taken together, the objective of the KT initiative is outreach to government and the SPAR sector to share knowledge, information, and inspiration as we grapple with the challenges and opportunities of the renewal and recovery of recreation, physical activity, and community sport in Canada. The need for physical activity and recreation is making headline news every day, it seems. We see headlines like, the pandemic has increased stress and lowered physical activity. Kids need more green time, not screen time. Why physical activity can improve your mental health, and the list goes on. We work in this domain and understand the benefits of physical activity, recreation, and community sport. But perhaps now Canadians are becoming more informed too. So the speaker series is a timely initiative for all of us to discuss and engage on the so what and the now what for the SPAR, the key policy questions that we're all thinking about. We want to fuel this spark. We want to harness this moment to support meaningful actions for Canadians and communities in the pandemic and post-pandemic eras, including a focus on equity and access is a vital part of this work. Today, our panelists will set the scene by exploring evidence on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on society and movement behaviors. They'll also speak to the value and role of physical activity and recreation in strengthening both community and individual health and well-being. The second session of the speaker series is coming up on March 8th, and it will expand on these ideas and by demonstrating how investment in physical activity and recreation can contribute to broader vitality and productivity of communities and improve population health. So you won't want to miss that. And it's going to feature a couple of success stories of cities that have done this, that have demonstrated transformative change for their residents, measurable impacts on well-being, economy, tourism, and so on. So I hope that you find today's session valuable and that it supports you in your policy and program work. Success would be learning from each other and finding actionable next steps to help us collectively move the needle on prioritizing physical activity and rec. Thank you, and over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Catherine. That was excellent. And I think just solidifies the reason why we are proud of our partnership with FPT Park. So during today's session, you're going to first hear from 3 presenters. They're going to speak for approximately 10 minutes each, and they're really going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on broader society and on physical activity and recreation. While you're listening, think about any questions that you might have, because we are going to have a chance for Q&A after those first 3 presentations. And also think about some resources or tools that might help you in digesting this information and using it to help you make decisions and actions in your day-to-day. I think you're all aware, but the session is being recorded. We are going to do our best to stay on time, but we know that sometimes conversations, interactions can be very rich and very hard to cut off on time. So if you do have to leave at the end of the session and it does seem like it's still going on, just know that it'll be recorded and you'll be able to refer to it at a later date. I'm going to do my best to keep us on time though. So the first thing I want to do, obviously, is introduce our first speaker to you. Dr. Lindsay McLaren is a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences and the O'Brien Institute for Public Health at the University of Calgary, where her research and teaching focus on healthy public policy and social and ecological determinants of health. She's also a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and she received the CHIR IPPH Trailblazer Award in 2019, which is an achievement award that recognizes exceptional contributions in population and public health research. Lindsay serves as senior editor for the Canadian Journal of Public Health. Lindsay, over to you.
Great, thank you, Mike, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're joining us from today. So thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this event. My comments today will focus on the broader societal context or implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've taken the liberty of adding opportunities to signal the importance of this historical moment with respect to looking forward. Next slide, please. So the anchor point for my comments today is equity. And I know that equity or social equity is very important both to the FTP committee and to the CPRA. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it quite clear that our current policy paradigm here in Canada and indeed globally does not support equity which we can define broadly as a fair and healthy society for everyone. There's many examples of why and how this is the case, but it comes down to our neoliberal economic framework, where economic growth and the accumulation of private wealth is the guiding principle. This framework has very significant implications for people and places. So, for example, in such an environment, access to services and health promoting resources is increasingly dependent on one's attachment to the paid labor force, or in other words, people are commodified. Where one chooses to live is heavily constrained by a housing market where incentives encourage housing as an investment rather than as a place to live. So it doesn't work very well for those with lower or even medium levels of income. And our ability to take substantive action on mitigating climate change and protecting our ecosystems, which are the most fundamental determinants of health and well-being, is stalled. Next slide, please. From my anchoring concept of equity, here is just one of potentially many illustrations of societal implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we all know very well by now, the public health measures that have been put in place changed the nature of work for many of us. But those changes played out in very different ways across the population. So this graph shows, using data from Canada's Labour Force Survey, the extent of job loss or loss of at least 50% of one's working hours by income quartile. So those in the top 25% and those in the bottom 25% of hourly wage. And so as you can see, well, things did not change too much for those in the top 25% of earners. Things changed quite dramatically for those in the bottom 25% of earners. And at the risk of stating the obvious, those who earn less are generally those who have fewer resources to withstand these losses in the first place. So there are two things that this graph doesn't show, but which I would also like to highlight. So first, during the same time period, and indeed subsequent to this, the very wealthiest members of our society profited quite significantly during the pandemic. And in fact, a recent report that focuses on Canada's 100 highest paid CEOs during 2020 showed that they recorded the second highest average compensation in the country's history. And this was during a global pandemic. Secondly, it's not random or arbitrary who falls into the top 25%, the bottom 25% of earners, nor those who fall into the very top of earners. So in the bottom 25%, we know that there's an overrepresentation of women, Indigenous persons, and otherwise racialized individuals. And amongst the very top earners, again, looking at the 100 top paid CEOs in Canada, those individuals are overwhelmingly male. And names including Michael, Scott, and Mark are disproportionately represented in that group. So the fallout of the pandemic, of which this is just one slice of the impact, had very much to do with intersecting social and economic identities. Next slide, please. So we have a significant opportunity to think about a new policy paradigm. The precarity of our current one of neoliberal economics is becoming increasingly clear. So the 2008 financial crisis threw it into question, and the pandemic has just continued to illustrate those challenges. Fortunately, and as was mentioned in the introductory comments, there is a growing amount of discussion around a coherent new approach, which we can call a well-being economy. There's different names for this. In a well-being economy, quality of life for everyone and the sustainability of our ecosystems are placed at the center of policymaking across governments. It's thus highly compatible with the equity lens that I'm offering here. In case this sounds too removed from current reality, I would just highlight that there are several important and concrete efforts in this direction, including by the current federal government with the quality of life framework that was included as part of the 2021 federal budget. That framework could provide a foundation for a well-being approach to budgeting, and broader decision-making. Next slide, please. So I'll close with a recent example of what a well-being economy could look like in practice. This is the 2022 alternative federal budget produced by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, who have been leading this initiative since the 90s. It not only shows in a concrete fashion what a well-being approach could look like, but it shows how we can pay for it. I'll just provide a couple of examples from this year's initiative that most obviously align with today's theme of people and places. So with respect to housing, the alternative federal budget recognizes that despite the presence of a national housing strategy and other housing policies, a very large number of people, around 1.6 million, still live in core housing need, and over 200,000 are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. So it outlines important reforms, including amending and evaluating the national housing strategy to ensure that it redresses these problems, expanding and accelerating the creation of affordable and sustainable non-market housing, and creating a housing acquisition fund to support the purchase of existing rental assets by community nonprofit housing providers, with the goal of maintaining the supply of affordable housing for low and modest income households over time. Secondly, of three that I'm going to mention, with respect to environment and climate change, it proposes a permanent funding stream for nature conservation in recognition of the very rapid pace at which biodiversity loss is occurring. It proposes the establishment of a permanent Just Transition Commission to oversee and manage the country's transition away from fossil fuel production. And a third example, with respect to community infrastructure, it proposes to reform the Canada Infrastructure Bank to become a fully publicly financed bank with a mandate to invest in publicly owned and publicly operated infrastructure that are in the public interest, that is aligned with equity and well-being for all, such as low carbon infrastructure and expansion of public transit. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I just want to remind everybody that as we're listening, you do have access to the Q&A kind of portal there, and you're more than welcome to throw questions or comments into that. The next speaker, Dr. John Spence, is actually going to be talking a little bit more about the impact of the pandemic on Canadians' movement behaviors. Dr. Spence spends most of his time relaxing in the sedentary living laboratory in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta. His expertise in the area of behavioral medicine, exercise science, and public health. His research focuses on both the benefits and determinants of physical activity and how physical inactivity and sedentary behavior influence health. More recently, he has focused on factors that impact mobility and active transportation, and the role of policy initiatives and strategies for promoting physical activity. Dr. Spence.
Thank you, Mike. And hello, bonjour. As Mike said, and as my title says, I've been asked to speak about COVID-related restrictions and potential impact on movement behaviors in the population. Next slide, please. This graph, this figure depicts step activity. So the proportion of steps people are taking per day. And it comes from Fitbit. And this data was pulled at near the end of March in 2020. So for North America, basically about a month and a half into the initial sort of stage one or phase one, round one of COVID. And you can see for Canada, North America, parts of Western Europe, there was about a 15% decrease in step activity per day. Whereas if you look at Australia, New Zealand down in the bottom right corner, you can see a relatively small decrease in step activity at that time. And the reason for that was COVID had not really hit that part of the world yet. I was in New Zealand, for instance, at the end of February and early March in 2020. And when I left New Zealand, COVID was in the news, but it hadn't hit New Zealand yet. So this shows a fairly immediate impact of COVID in terms of how people were moving around. And Canada was on par with several other countries in terms of a decrease in step activity. Next slide, please. Now, my group was the first group to examine some of the factors that were associated with changes or impacts on movement behavior in the population. And we did a study in the UK, and this was conducted in about May, June of 2020, so several months after the Fitbit data. And we were interested to see if, okay, is there an impact on total activity, but what's happening in the various domains of physical activity? So home-based, work-based, neighborhood-based, facilities-based, and active transportation. On this figure, the blue bar represents less engaging and less in that activity in that domain. Red is the same and green is more. So in terms of overall activity, there was actually not that much difference in what was happening. If you combine same and more, for instance, you'll see that it would be on par or even a bit above those reporting doing less. But when you look in the domains, you can see some major variations in what was going on. So for instance, work-based and facilities-based, going to the gym, going to some sort of recreation facility, there was a substantial decrease in activity in those domains. Whereas around the home and in the neighborhood, there was probably more activity going on than less. And then active transportation, you can see a significant proportion of the population reporting engaging in less active transportation at the time, which makes sense because they had nowhere to go. We were in still fairly significant restrictions, quarantines. In the UK, they called it a lockdown. This is important because it tells us that in some places there might have actually been an increase in activity, whereas in others there was a decrease. Okay, so what's going on in Canada? Next slide, please. Data from CFRI, and we see it from other sources too for Canadian data, shows a similar pattern to what I just reported for the UK. This data was collected in 2021, about the middle of the year in 2021. So we're now well into the sort of COVID-2 by now. And it reports on activity at work or school, traveling to work or school, or at rec facilities. And if you look in the left column, you see that the greatest proportion is in that column, whether it be about activity at work, active transportation, or at rec facilities. So that in the absence of being able to go to work or go to various facilities, we were engaging in less activity. Next slide, please. Now in children, we see somewhat of a similar pattern. The data that's presented here is a 6-month follow-up to data that was originally collected in April of 2020, so about a month after the Fitbit data. This was with Canadian children from across the country. And so the data that's being shown here was collected in late fall, early winter of 2020, and 2020 into 2021. The top circle, the first set of data that's there is for outdoor play, walking, those types of things. If you see a green arrow, that's showing that there has been an increase or a change in a positive direction for those behaviors over that 6-month period. So basically in April, we saw low levels of outdoor play overall, physical activity and sport overall. But over the 6-month period, there started to be a shift back toward sort of norm or typical. The second circle or ellipse shows the sort of inactivities and sedentary type activities. And you'll note there's somewhat of a decrease in those activities over that period. So kids were getting more active and engaging in less sedentary type activities over that 6-month period. So that's a positive sort of trend, and we would hope to see that pattern increase. Next slide, please. So in terms of, Catherine mentioned at the outset that we know that mental health and physical activity are associated, that there are positive benefits of physical activity for mental health. Our research in the UK showed that if people were physically active or reported an increase in physical activity during the COVID period, that they were reporting lower levels of boredom proneness and greater subjective well-being. Similarly, in North America with Canadian adults and US adults, we know that physical activity was one way of helping to deal with some of the negative effects of social distancing. Unfortunately, most Canadians do not report engaging in physical activity for addressing stress and anxiety. Instead, they are more likely to resort to more sedentary activities, particularly in their leisure time, things like watching TV and engaging with the computer. So if there's an implication out of this that more messaging around the mental health benefits of physical activity could be one option. Next slide, please. So what have we maybe learned about, what insight may we have gleaned around the role of national and global strategies for promoting physical activity, recreation, and sport, particularly during the COVID context? I'd say there's a few things. One is how critically important it is for us to have data, particularly near real-time data, and organizations such as the Canadian Fitness Lifestyle Research Institute, FAC, and via Stats Canada have collected a fair amount of data during this period, and is allowing us to be able to see and detect potential trends or patterns. Secondly, the role of the built environment and our neighborhoods environments, I think, became critically important, in my opinion, during COVID, because those were the places where we were able to recreate and engage with the community. And things like the Framework for Recreation places an emphasis on this, and I think it was fairly clear. Next slide, please. So what are the key points? No question that COVID-related restrictions had an impact on physical activity, recreation, and sport participation, mostly in a negative way. And there was an increase in engagement in sedentary type activities, but there was variation in the various domains of activity, physical activity, and we saw the importance of the local neighborhood, and potentially about infrastructure to support active transportation. The mental health benefits of physical activity and recreation, I think, should be promoted more widely. Potential equity issues, what Dr. McLaren talked about in terms of who was impacted the most in terms of COVID. Those in that lowest income quartile, they're also the ones that are more likely to begin using things like public transit to get to work. And there were some significant impacts on their ability to be able to do that. As I said before, in terms of national strategies, I think the importance of that sort of built environment for facilitating active transportation was clear to me, and that school-based and work-related activities account for a fairly significant proportion of the steps and daily activity that adults engage in and that kids engage in during the day. So we saw that accounting for probably the most of the decrease that we observed in activity in Canada. And with that, I'll say thank you and look forward to any questions and discussion.
Thanks a lot, John. I appreciate that. And we're actually going to invite another John to come on camera and continue on as our third presenter. John Frittenberg's president of the JF Group and project lead of Reimagine Rec, which is that, I guess, leadership piece that I'd mentioned at the outset of the meeting, and something that CPRA, in partnership with Sport Canada, was able to complete over the course of the last couple of years. The JF Group's a nationally recognized management consultancy specializing in sport, recreation, and physical activity. Throughout John's 35-year career, he's assisted municipal, commercial, and not-for-profit clients stay abreast of key trends while developing strategies for success. The JF Group's client list includes federal, provincial, and municipal governments, as well as national, provincial, and municipal sport and recreation organizations that operate facilities and deliver sport and recreation related services. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be providing you with some insights that we uncovered as part of the Reimagine Rec project. And first of all, I would like to say that the project is led by a project team that included Brian Johnson from British Columbia, Larry Ketchison from Ontario, Pierre Morin from Quebec, Diane English from CPRA and also in Ontario, and somebody who I know many of you are quite familiar with, Joe Doran from the Halifax area. Joe has also been involved with helping with significant help with the development of our workshop series, as well as today's speaker series. So a vote of thanks to Joe. Next slide, please. The Reimagine Rec project was basically a research project that included four key elements. The first was a review of existing surveys. We were originally going to survey people. This is back in the summertime and the early fall of 2020, but we decided not to, and simply to look at existing surveys because frankly, the field told us they were surveyed out. So we looked at 150 different surveys, many of which were from Canada. We did a scoping review of both pure and gray literature to look at the trends that were happening worldwide. We did 170 key informant interviews, which were conducted right across the country, or at least participated virtually by people from right across the country. We also conducted a number of special interest groups, including big cities, women and girls, as well as northern communities. And we also solicited next and best practices, of which we received 70 applicants or 70 examples. They were graded and evaluated. And so all of this information is being presented to the field on CPRA's bench. It's available currently. Next slide, please. Key learnings. First of all, we know the sector, and I'm talking, when I say sector, I'm talking the broader sector, the sport, community sport, recreation, physical activity sector is under siege. We know that staff that are traditionally working in the sector are being called upon to do various things that they've never done before. As you know, several community recreation facilities, for example, have doubled up as food distribution sites or vaccination sites or testing sites. And very often staff that are working at those facilities are called into action to assist in those services that they've never been caused to be involved with before. We know that there are a number of different changes that they're going to have to, the people working within the sector are going to have to respond to. Some are legislated. In other words, some are related to the restrictions to which they have to work with. And others are really dependent upon the preferences of the clientele. People are looking at making sure that they're entering into a safe environment, whether or not that environment is able to be accessed under regulation. So it's important to not only serve the needs of the legislators, but also the general population with respect to making sure their comfort. We know that COVID, as my previous colleagues have mentioned, we know that COVID has laid bare many of the cracks and challenges that existed in the system in advance of COVID happening, but it certainly magnified it. And you don't have to look very much further than the long-term care sector to see exactly what I'm talking about. So there are inequities that exist and that were magnified. For example, we know that COVID had a bigger impact on women than it did on men, primarily because of working at home and the domestic responsibility, disproportionate amount of that picked up by women, and therefore balancing those things became challenging. It also appears that the changes that are going to be required to move out of the COVID period are likely to be at least near term, if not long term, in their impact on the sector, in how it operates, how it's designed, and so on. It should come as no surprise, and John mentioned this, that is that activities in the outdoors exploded as soon as the indoor opportunities were taken offline. And this created a whole bunch of new challenges that especially those in the public sector had to deal with. For example, parks were overrun with people. In BC, for example, trails were overloaded. We know that search and rescue budgets were strained because of people going into spaces they'd never been in before. And so it was really a learning experience and a learn on the fly experience. In terms of recovery, we know that, next slide, please. We know that there are two different areas that we're going to have to worry about. The first is policy. Policy would really be the guide rails to how we're going to be moving forward from the old normal to whatever the new normal looks like. And then, of course, we've got program impacts, and I'll speak a little bit about this in a moment, with respect to how we're going to recover, both in terms of complying with the legislative requirements, while at the same time making sure people are comfortable within the environments. So some key themes that have emerged and that will be required to be responded to. Organizations are desperately looking for help and guidance. This ranges anywhere from organizations that are structured to newly formed organizations, such as recreation directors getting on Zoom calls every Friday to share experiences and their own solutions that they've come up with. So there is a desperate need right now for some guidance, and so for some public sector, especially in the public sector, I should say. There are new demands being placed on the sport, recreation, and physical activity sector that have never been placed on them before. As I mentioned earlier, they've been brought into providing social services that were never part of the responsibilities in the past. In fact, in many corners of the country, we're seeing recreation and community sport seen as part of the social service safety net. We know that demand varies across the country depending upon where they are with respect to the COVID response. But we know that coming out of this, it's very, very likely that from a program perspective, there's going to be a combination of in-person to virtual. And right now, best minds are suggesting it might be 60, 65 to 40, 35, favoring in-person versus virtual. But the jury's still out on that mix, although everybody is suggesting in unison that a hybrid approach to program delivery is very likely going to be the case. Just as an example, there have been 375,000 new fitness apps developed since 2020. So that's a good indication of the number of people who are actually looking at having some guidance to their physical activity, whatever that might be, through virtual means. So there is organizational transformation happening. I'm seeing evidence right across the country where there is cross-sectoral planning. I'm involved with one facility development out west, for example, that is designing a public health office right in a new recreation community center. So there definitely is now cross-sectoral planning and hopefully implementation in the long term. Vulnerable populations obviously is a key theme and one that needs to be part of an overall recovery strategy. And also in terms of preferences, as I said earlier, safety is the #1 preference that people are going to be looking for. And this is safety, both in terms of what they're told, but also what they see and what they experience. People need to be safe, and they need to know what the organization is doing to keep them safe. So this could range anywhere from physical to actually programmatic changes that would help to communicate this to them. Communication is also extremely important, and if I'm asked once, I've asked several times during a week how best to communicate these changes, while at the same time trying to encourage people to maintain their level of physical activity and to get back into some form of physical activity. In terms of relevant findings, we have, as we have been talking about, created workshops that have been delivered across the country. We finished 4, and the 5th one is coming up in March. Each one of those workshops has some fact sheets and infographics included to try to make it simple for practitioners to see what we've discovered and useful information that they can use to plan their own recovery strategies. And remember, it is important that these strategies are local, because the circumstances that recreation community sport practitioners are in across the country is different, different vaccination rates, different restrictions, and so on. So the solutions need to be local, based on fact, that can be national, but it has to be localized in terms of its application. So I'll just, there's way too many details to give you a comprehensive, but just let me close with just a few. First of all, community sport and recreation messaging, the message that we have been delivering in the sector for the past 20 or 25 years in terms of the importance of physical activity and recreation pursuits in terms of a whole variety of community health benefits is now resonating, especially with municipal officials. In fact, one survey illustrated that 94% of Canadian municipal officials understand the importance of physical activity, recreation, and community sport participation on improving health metrics. Now, that's a huge finding, because if we have political officials on board understanding the importance of this, they can be part of the overall solution. We also know that 95% of the public understand that sport, recreation, physical activity is seen as essential to their physical and mental well-being. So we both have the elected officials on side, and we have the general public on side, which is unprecedented in terms of acceptance of the importance of these services. We also know, for example, that community sport organizations have told us that they are desperately suffering. And 21% of community sport organizations indicate that without some financial support, it's likely they will not survive. So what that means is there may be a preference of an adult to enroll their children in community soccer, and there may not be a community soccer association in that community to register with. So community sport organizations do require supports, not just financial, but also in guidance with respect to how they might want to do things a little bit differently coming out of this thing. To feed off of what Lindsay said a little bit earlier, there are 17,000 fewer workers in the sport, recreation, and community sport realm than there were in 2018. And I would hazard to guess, based upon the chart that Lindsay showed with respect to the number of people who are no longer working or who decided to move to a different occupation, being in that lower income group, I would suspect, although the numbers here don't actually tell me that story, but I would suspect that many of the people who left the sector are in that group. In other words, they were entry-level people or people earning lower wages. Through our research, we also discovered a hierarchy of controls, and those controls that are the most effective down to the lesser effective means of controlling viral spread. This has been studied by several occupational health and safety organizations, including the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. It talks about the level of effectiveness in terms of spread, and as you might viral spread, and as you might suspect, The top of the list, in other words, what is most effective, is preventing viruses from entering an environment like a facility, for example, which speaks to the notion of vaccine mandates and making sure people are in fact vaccinated. They're allowed to participate in those facilities. The next is engineering. Air handling, of course, is percolating to the top of the list now that we know that this particular virus is spread through aerosol transmission. So air handling, air quality, filtration, lots and lots of technologies are being developed in this particular regard. Administrative controls is next on the list. That includes things like spacing, elimination of pinch points, the capacity issues with respect to certain programming, especially if that programming is happening indoors. It also appears that there's a great amount of emphasis on moving forward with reprogramming certain types of activities that people can do now outdoors rather than indoors. So I think you'll see a lot more of that, both in terms of how people are going to actually equip their outdoor environments. One recreation director in one of the metropolitan areas said that she felt that she was the commissioner, instead of being the commissioner of recreation, she was the commissioner of privies, because she was getting requests left, right, and center with respect to washroom access, especially during the wintertime. Surface sanitation and PPE, also important, but lesser so in terms of the ability to keep environments safe. So in closing, there's lots and lots of work that needs to be done in terms of moving the sector from its current place to a new place in response to what the new norm might look like. But I think we're starting to see some promising advances with respect to knowledge that we've got that we can act on in order to be able to make the sector a true contributor to the public health of Canadians. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer your questions when we get to that portion of the program.
Thanks a lot, John. And actually, I'll invite you to just leave your camera on, John, and I'll invite Dr. Spence and Dr. McLaren to come back on camera as well. While they're doing that, I want to draw everybody's attention to the chat. So posted in the chat are both English and French versions of the slide deck that our presenters just went through. And I also want to just remind everybody that you have an opportunity to ask questions, or even to share some ideas about how getting this information to you or other tools might kind of help you in your day to day. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now, and that's actually a good thing because we're a little bit behind time here. So we're probably just going to jump right into our panel discussion, and that's going to include our three presenters, but it's also going to include a couple other individuals. So the first being Carolyn Nault. So Carolyn's a program leader and co-CEO of Waterways Manitoba, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization that works to support community wellness by using canoeing and outdoor recreation to connect Indigenous youth to cultural skills and identities. She's a Métis woman living on Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of her people. She has a particular calling to create spaces for other Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people to feel safe and celebrated in sport and recreation. Through her work and personal life, she's experienced the joy, empowerment, and healing that movement and connection to the land and water brings to people of all ages, and loves to share it with others whenever given the chance. She's also done work with creating and speaking at the annual TRC and Sport event hosted by the Manitoba Aboriginal Sport and Recreation Council, which was designed to educate the provincial sport organizations in Manitoba on the importance and implementation of the calls to action. So welcome, Carolyn. You can put your camera on now too. There you go. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. The next individual I want to introduce is Steve Kellogg. So he's recently joined the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation as Director of Recreation. And Steve brings more than 2 decades of experience in municipal parks, recreation, and culture. Previously leading the City of New Westminster as Senior Manager of Recreation Services and Facilities. Steve is a respected leader of recreation across the province of British Columbia. He sits on the board of directors as president-elect for the British Columbia Recreation and Parks Association, and was a member of the CEO Advisory Committee for the province's restart plan for the BCRPA. He also serves on our board, the board that I chair, the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association and is passionate about recreation and community development and is a champion of inclusion and equity with a focus on recreation and parks for all. So welcome, Steve. So as part of the panel discussion, there's a couple of topics that I'm going to introduce and then just invite the panelists to respond to. But before I do that, I might just ask Carolyn and Steve, maybe Carolyn, you first, if you have any reflections about the presentations that we've heard today from your perspective. So go ahead, Carolyn.
Tashi Kioao, Carolyn no Dishnakashin. I mean, Miskiu Webinusi Kwe Dishnakashin, Machipnia, Winnipeg Dosche. So hi everybody, my name is Carolyn No. I've also shared with you my traditional name, which is Red Sash Woman. So listening to our very eloquent presenters today, I'm so thankful to be a part of this and to have the opportunity to hear these presentations and be a part of the feedback for it. One thing that really stood out for me is and I'm sure this is a very common experience for everyone hearing the new normal, when we talk about the effects of the pandemic. And Lindsay's presentation about the mission critical, and although it looks very different from what the system that we are currently used to operating in as far as government and policy and all of these things, now's the perfect time to implement these changes of things that seem new and scary and unfamiliar, and we may have resistance to it because we've always done things a certain way. And now we're at a time where we know that a lot of those things are not working for everyone in the country. So now's the time I would urge you to take some reflection and see where you can push against the resistance to change, because now's the time.
Excellent. Thanks, Carolyn. And Dr. Spence, I don't know if you're monitoring the Q&A, if you can see it, but there's a question there for you based on your presentation. So while you're pondering that, I might invite Steve to share any reflections he might have on the previous presentations. Then we'll come back to you, Dr. Spence. Go ahead, Steve. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Mike. Today I'm joining you from the ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in the area now known as British Columbia. I'd echo Carolyn's just acknowledgement and recognition of the great presentations this morning. So thank you to all three of you. One of the things that stood out for me is the comment from John on the unprecedented nature of support and the time that we're living in. But I think what struck me from all three presentations is we're also in a time of unprecedented data. And particularly thinking, Dr. Spence, you called out some of the shifts in the 6-month mark during the pandemic. And so one of my musings and takeaways that I'm going to reflect on is that's about the same time that a lot of our spaces reopened. And maybe there's an opportunity to look into how the reopening of spaces, you spoke to how we need to do better in our messaging, in the importance and the necessity of the services we offer. So maybe this data can help to reinforce some of those important messages as we continue to leverage this unprecedented time of opportunity. So thanks to all three of you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and good point. And I bring this up not with any political undertone, but in Alberta where I am, we just got rid of the QR code requirement like yesterday. And I might have been one of the only people in the population that was sad about that, because I see that scanning that has to happen when you enter rec facilities as another source of that data. Dr. Spence, do you mind, did you have a chance to review that question, and do you have a response?
Yeah, so the question was asking about the potential of seasonality having some influence on the patterns that we're seeing, and or what would the effect of seasonality be. So first, seasonality, there's no question there's seasonality effects. If we look throughout a year, and we did some work on this a number of years ago and published a review on it. There are effects when you live in, climates where you do have changes of seasons. There are seasonal effects, and in the wintertime, we tend to be less active than in the summertime, for instance. In terms of the COVID-related data, what has been done by and large, any of the data that I reported here, for instance, asks people to compare with the same time pre-COVID or last year. So it's always relative to whatever you were, the same season. So for instance, the CFRI data was asking people again about what they were doing compared to the same time last year. So it removes the effect of seasonality. And then Steve, yeah, you're right. There's some different patterns of sort of quarantining, social distancing, and or lockdown across the country throughout the last 18 months. And we've seen some variation in the extent to which children were engaging in the outdoors or not, depending on how restrictive the extent of restriction that was in place. So, later on, that will give us some sense of, yeah, if you tell people they can't go to the park, what happens? And you're very right. There is a mound and a wealth of data that is coming out and available to us that we're trying to synthesize to be able to determine what those patterns are.
It'll keep us all busy for quite a while, Dr. Spence. Thanks for that. So the other question embedded in that question, I'm not sure if any of the other panelists saw that, but just had to do with the seasonality that Dr. Spence responded to, as well as kind of regional discrepancies. So I don't know if just to wrap that question up, if anybody else has anything to offer related to maybe regional. I see John, go ahead.
Yes, I see more intention. I can't say that intention is necessarily translated into action quite yet, but I see more intention to outfit parks, for example, with new kinds of equipment that isn't necessarily seasonally dependent. Certainly, as I mentioned during my presentation, there's much more pressure now to winterize park washrooms. Just if nothing more than for people to go for walks, which has traditionally not been something that has been offered. They've usually been closed and locked for the wintertime. Some of the architects that have been talking to us with respect to new design implications with respect to facilities, actually a new term emerged as a result of this. Instead of being indoor and outdoor, they're talking about mid-door. In other words, maybe it's a nice surface that's covered by a canopy with no walls, and infrared heating for wintertime activity basically outside. So there's new innovations happening in an attempt to maximize the opportunities for people outdoors, especially during the wintertime. There's far less limitations in the summertime or on the shoulder seasons, but in the wintertime for sure. And of course, again, as Dr. Spence was mentioning, that's dependent on where you are in the country, because of course, if you're in northern climes, your seasonality impact is going to be much longer than in southern climes. Now, of course, the majority of our people live not far from the US border, so most of them are impacted with a little bit warmer temperatures, but I would think for sure in the long term, there's going to be more emphasis placed on outdoor activity. In the near term. Whether it's long term, that remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And actually, just to all the panelists, I know in our pre-session, I said we wouldn't use hands, but I'd invite you to use your hand if you want. If you have something to say, that way I'll know, and I'll try to make eye contact with all you too. Great, Carolyn, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to loop back to something that John said in his presentation as well about the new demand. So while we're talking about the new developments that are happening as far as access in parks and things like that, he mentioned that the increased demand for sport and recreation to be connected to social services, essentially. That's something that, from my experience, both as an Indigenous person working in the Indigenous sport and rec sector, that's actually a demand that has always existed within this, within our sector. And so it's new for the rest of the sport and recreation in the country. But for us, it's something that has always been there, but now there's also an increased demand too. So it's like there's It's being mirrored, the increase, but it's been heightened from what it was previously. So that was something that was in my reflections too that I just forgot to mention earlier. So I wanted to add that.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thank you very much. And Dr. McLaren, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'll just add a few comments to what's already been said, some excellent points being made here. So with respect to data, the pandemic, I think one of the good things the pandemic has done is it's illuminated some of the deficits in our data systems around population-based statistics. So for example, we haven't done a great job in terms of disaggregated or stratified data by axes of social identity. And that's obviously critical. And also data collection processes that respect principles of safe data collection and appropriate ownership and control. So I think, efforts that are emerging in that front are a good thing, or they're promising. Secondly, with respect to outdoor activities, and I guess I also wonder if it would be helpful to maybe connect some of the dots between the things that I had to say and the things that my esteemed co-presenters had to say. I actually hear a tremendous amount of consistency in our comments. I think the main difference is that I'm maybe going farther back to the root causes of what's underlying these different trends. And I also see physical activity and recreation as absolutely integral to a coherent policy paradigm that privileges well-being and quality of life. I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree that being able to move and being able to get around in a way that's appropriate to your, life stage, ability level, et cetera, is critical to well-being and quality of life. So I think there's a huge amount of consistency there. But I think an example of where the lenses maybe complement each other would be the thoughts that I have on outdoor activities outside of urban centers, such as the national parks and the recreation areas, et cetera. I am very privileged to live close to several national parks and recreation areas. And in my province here of Alberta, one thing that's changed recently is that I now pay a user fee to go cross-country skiing where I didn't before. And that's not a lot of skin off my back. I can afford it. But what comes to mind for me is, well, why don't I have to pay to drive on the highway to get there? And the skiing should be free, right? So that's one example of our accounting structure privileging certain things over others. And another example with respect to the national parks, and as John Frittenberg mentioned, some of these are absolutely overrun with people, and they are. And there's efforts to, I think there's a bit of a tension between access to the parks, letting everyone go and access them, but what are the implications for things like wildlife corridors and the integrity of the land and our natural environments? So right now, for example, at Lake Louise, they're trying to find ways to get more people into the park itself before having to get on a bus to go to the lake, whereas it used to be out on the highway. And so I just think that's such a great example of how our economic system, or the way our accounting works and what it privileges, is all out of whack, because it's privileging tourism and economic growth at the direct expense of the quality and integrity of our natural environments, including coexisting with wildlife. And so if we were to take this opportunity to think really ambitiously, as Carolyn beautifully said, we could actually think about trying to shift that accounting structure so that it privileges these types of things that we all agree would be way better and just for everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. And there is a couple more questions in the Q&A. I think we'll just maybe handle one more and then we'll get into our topics, but we will have time to circle back on that Q&A in a bit. I think the one that I'd like to pose to everybody is just in relation to kind of older adults, activity patterns, and maybe the future of re-engaging older adults in physical activity and recreation after the pandemic. So I'm not sure if that's who wants to try to tackle that question, but it's definitely of interest here. It's actually mentioned twice in the Q&A. So I don't see anybody's hand going up necessarily, but I don't know if one of the Johns might have an answer to that. Go ahead.
You know, one of the things that came out of COVID too was the fact that if we're dependent solely on programming and facilities for our physical activity and active recreation, that something like a pandemic, when it comes along and requires those facilities and programming to be removed or shut down, that we have a bit of a vacuum. And so then we found people sort of taking over the streets. There's all sorts of examples of where streets were closed down and people loved the idea that they could use that roadway. Going back to what Lindsay was talking about, why do we dedicate so much space to vehicles, whereas you go to some parts of Europe, for instance, and they dedicate more space to walking lanes and cycling lanes. And I think for older adults in particular, in the summertime, okay, we can go out perhaps and walk around in our community, but in the wintertime, especially in harsher climates, if you're in Edmonton right now, it's a skating rink on the sidewalks. They're just, if there's any concerns about falls or so forth, they're just not going out there. But yeah, one of the other things too were people who were in facilities, assisted living facilities and so forth. That was where, there were some interesting things that happened on in terms of programming that occurred in there. But I would argue that I don't know there's going to be a new norm around physical activity across the population unless we do take advantage, as Lindsay has mentioned and Carolyn has mentioned, of some opportunities to be able to facilitate activity perhaps in some different ways. Otherwise, I would argue, because humans they'll go back to the center, so to speak, and we don't like to expend energy unless we absolutely need to or unless it's really fulfilling. And so my concerns are we'll just go back to the way things were unless we do take advantage of some of the opportunities that were mentioned here. So I don't know if I've really answered the older adult question, but.
Yeah, I think you did, John, and obviously, like there's a lot more kind of research or data out there that our listeners, I guess, or our participants can get their hands on. We are going to be providing some other resources that you could access or possibly read and tap into. I mean, the one slide that you had in your presentation, John, about kids and kind of starting to go back or to, I don't want to say go back to normal, but definitely gravitate away from the extremes of participation that they might have experienced in the height of the pandemic is probably a promising kind of outcome, but
it's promising to get us sort of out of the hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
But if I come back in 6 months and show you another slide and it just shows us back to the center line as opposed to more time outdoors and less time even engaging with screens, then I would say, yeah, we're back to the quote unquote old norm.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
We would have missed our opportunity if that was the case. Understood.
Mike, if I might, some of the information that was contained in our literature review and the survey data did speak specifically to the older adult populations. And interestingly enough, their concerns were not that much different than the other populations, other than the various access points that they have available to them. So that, yes, they were interested in making sure that those activities, whatever they may be, would be safe. In fact, I believe, just from memory, that their desire for safe environments actually were higher than the general population. But in any case, it did cross over. And I did see one question in the Q&A that did ask about the research and whether or not our research was simply public sector. No, it was not. The research included public sector and private sector information and surveys and so on. So there was a good cross section there of both data sets in order to be able to come up with some of the recommendations that we were talking about. But I think getting back to a question or a comment that was made a little earlier, some of the things that we're talking about are not necessarily brand new ideas that have emerged from COVID, but rather may have been already being implemented in certain pockets that now are going to be a much broader and broadly accepted approach. So for example, Carolyn mentioned a little bit earlier, the whole need to become more entrenched in recreation and sport participation being part of the whole social service fabric. Well, in community recreation development design, for example, building in teaching kitchens is not a unique feature anymore. That is something that is often happening. But taking it beyond that, and as I said, putting public health offices right in community centers. So it's a kind of a one-stop shop. Not only does it give service availability, but also draws the connection quite visibly that this is something that's interconnected. Another thing that is quite important is one of the surveys, or several of the surveys that we studied, said that parents are interested in getting their kids re-engaged in organized activity, although the parent and themselves might be more interested in unsupervised and more spontaneous activity. So that was one thing. And the second thing is that parents that want to re-engage their kids in organized sport are interested in signing them up in 1 or 2 sports, not the 3 or 4 that they were signed up in before. Because while they want them engaged in physical activity, they also have enjoyed having dinner with them 4 or 5 nights a week and not running in 5 different directions to swimming pools and to hockey arenas. So I think just by that, you will find probably a reduction in the total number of sport registrations, simply because they're registering in 1 or 2 or 3 sports a year rather than 4, 5, or 6. So, and that came out loud and clear in several studies.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm not sure that even one sport allows you to eat with your family, but we'll go on to Carolyn. Go ahead.
I just want to add to what John is saying, because yeah, this is absolutely great. The one thing that I think is executed really well in a lot of Indigenous-based programs is multi-generational programming. So we are so used to the sports sector being very, very structured, very rigid, very based in like, okay, this is the age for this particular team and they have to learn these exact skills and this is the way we're going to do it. And these are the coaches and they are viewed this way. But when you allow space for programming that is more holistically based and a little bit more unstructured, and when I say unstructured, I mean more opportunities for things to evolve organically. Like I'm thinking particularly about when I go into a community and I'm doing a canoe program with a group of kids. We work with ages 10 to 16, all in the same group. All those different ages are bringing something different to the program. So it's really interesting to watch the kids fall into their natural roles of like the older ones are naturally looking out for the younger ones a little bit more, are helping them out if they need help. The younger ones are looking to the older ones for help or learning things from them. And not only in the different ages between the kids, but when we see the adults engage with the kids in a way that is, I would say, outside the norm of our current like sport organization. So instead of the adult being the strict authority, you must do what this coach says, they own you as an athlete, basically, is what a lot of the culture is, and it's very unhealthy. When you see the adults get to kind of relax and engage with that part of themselves that is also still a kid, it's like engaging with the holistic idea of play, because that's something that as we age is kind of taken from us and we're told that we must behave in certain ways. And so I think it has led to where we currently are now in a lot of our unhealthy sport culture, but trying to undo that and giving the opportunity for that unstructured engagement between the generations you see the connection that happens between the kids and the adults. Like when the adults are like flipping the boats, and it's like, they look like a big kid. They're having the time of their lives. They're laughing so hard, and everyone is just engaged fully in the present, and is moving their bodies and enjoying it. And everyone's getting so much benefit, not only the physical benefit and the mental health benefit, but also the emotional and the spiritual as well, like the whole person. And that's something that, although for the older generations, if we're talking like, 60 to 80 and older, although they may not be able to get in the boats and roughhouse and play with the kids like very physically like that, there is still an important role for those ages to play in our programs. So we do always make sure that we incorporate bringing in an elder or a knowledge keeper in the communities that we're in. And when I say communities, I don't just mean like on reserve. I mean, like if we're working with a group within a city or within an urban setting, it's like, who do we know that is part of this community that we can bring in? So having someone from an older generation participating in a plant walk, or even just sharing stories of what it was like for them growing up, and different sports and activities that they participated in. And then of course, like with our with my Indigenous brothers and sisters, a lot of the times that incorporates their experiences in residential school, which is a big part of generational healing too. But I do think that there is a lot of opportunity to make a shift to more intergenerational programming. And I think that's something we could take advantage of more.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Carolyn, and speaks to like the broad ranging benefits of physical activity and recreation as well. I do want to, so this is an example of enriching conversation that is hard to kind of put a timeline around, but there are a couple of topics that we want to get to for sure within the next 15 minutes or so. And then we very well might in fact go beyond that time, and you might want to tune back in when the recording is sent out. But the first topic that I want to move us into is about promoting physical activity. So, and Steve, I'm giving you a heads up. I'm going to ask you to speak to this first, but I'm just going to introduce it first. So almost intuitively, many Canadians during the pandemic felt the need to get outdoors, to go for walks, ride their bike, look for other ways to move. And I think the pandemic has in a lot of ways reinforced where physical activity, I think, wanted to go, with there being an increase in daily movement behaviors versus more structured opportunities. So considering this and considering all of the material that we were kind of presented today and our experiences, I guess our own experiences and observations, how do you think we can capitalize on that shift, and more specifically around promoting physical activity? What should we do moving forward? Where should our resources go? So Steve, I'll let you go first, and then any of the other panelists, just let me know when you want to go next.
Thanks, Mike. And we've had a lot of great conversation already today. So this is going to probably pull in some of the things that have already come up. But traditionally for us, recreation has been delivered within the four walls, with limited support for outdoor recreation and or flexible recreation. And one little flag that I just want to add into the conversation, I think worth noting, is that the pandemic has interrupted the social fabric that's so important in communities, and recreation has always been a vehicle for connection. Our role as we restore the social fabric and community connections that have been disrupted, whether inside the four walls or out in our new ways of delivering our services, are increasingly important. One of the areas here in Vancouver that we're currently prioritizing is looking at the built environment so that active transportation is an easy option for daily life to be carried out. So like John mentioned, looking to some of those European precedent models where we've done this well. In our planning in Vancouver, our 100-year vision identifies a network of parks, green spaces, and recreation areas interwoven into everyday life and connects us to nature and each other and to ourselves. Our vision includes park access within a 5-minute walk for all residents, and transportation greenways that make access to our parks and recreation spaces safe, easy, and accessible for all. So a couple of recent examples that were catapulted by the pandemic. was conversion of conversion of parking lots and roadways into public plazas and greenways. So Vancouver, as most know, is a very densely populated urban core in Canada, if not the most densely populated. And so we have many constraints in terms of our ability to plan for new parks and recreation spaces. We've recently used pilot programs as a way to bring in and take over some of those spaces, recognizing when you think of equity in Vancouver, only approximately 60% of our population owns a vehicle. So we're prioritizing public realm spaces for a small portion of our overall population. Reassignment of parking lots and roads to allow for public plazas and greenways met some of the immediate needs that emerged during the pandemic in terms of our overused park spaces. So we did add a greenway through Stanley Park, taking our bikes, taking our skateboards and our e-scooters off of our seawall, freeing up a vehicle lane to allow for that kind of active transportation and allowing increased use of the seawall for pedestrians. And that was able to accommodate those increased participation levels. Another example was converting the parking lot at Sunset Beach into a public plaza, and it allowed for formal and informal physical activity use, in addition to public gathering, art, and engagement opportunities. The demonstrated success of these pilots and the current public and political will, as previously mentioned, to expand on these initiatives reinforces why it's important at this time to be focused on the public built environment. And that's one of the areas that we're currently focusing on.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm actually going to open it up to both topics. So the first one is just about the promotion of physical activity and where should our resources go moving forward to capitalize on this momentum or this opportunity that we have. And the next is just speaking about the essential role that physical activity and recreation play in revitalizing and strengthening communities in general. And I think for both of these questions, I mean, I heard answers to both of those questions throughout the presentations and all of the discussion that happened afterwards, but just kind of framing it that way, I'd invite panelists to speak to either one of those, just in terms of focus for promoting physical activity and recreation and the role that that PA and Rec have in revitalizing and strengthening communities. Dr. Spence, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was interested to hear some of the initiatives that Steve mentioned for Vancouver. I think one of the things that came out of COVID was this rush to purchase bicycles and then even e-bikes, and there's a waiting list. In some parts of the country, you're waiting 12, 18 months to be able to get your e-bike, for instance. But even road bikes, bikes used for transportation, there's waiting lists, backlogs on them. We've heard stories of it. I know out in Alberta, in the national parks, there's a major battle going on right now because people are riding e-bikes, 30, 40 kilometers out into the backcountry, and that's creating tension, grinding up the trails, but also you're getting individuals out into parts of the parks that don't really know what they're doing. So I think there's this sort of tension around how do we facilitate this sort of very acute and recent demand and influx of for bikes and then the use of bikes, both pedal assist and e-assist. So that's why I said before, I think the active transportation infrastructure is something, and we've got this new national transportation strategy, and I think it's going to be critically important. I had said 6 months ago, I felt there was a window of opportunity for us to, if there is to be some sort of a new norm that we could try and take advantage of and facilitate. Without any facilitation, as I said before, humans being humans, will go back to what we used to do. So that individual that was excited to ride their bike somewhere, last summer, are they going to do that this summer? Or is it, oh, now I can do the things I used to do? So I think this support facilitation for things like active transportation, I think will be critically important to be able to keep that window open. And as I said, things like e-bikes, e-scooters, and then autonomous vehicles further down the road, those are also going to be things that are going to, you know, facilitate or bring in some tension that we need to address.
Yeah, Dr. Spence, understood. And I think you're tying into something that Carolyn mentioned and some of the other presenters spoke to, and that's the cross-sectoral nature of physical activity and recreation. And I think of that question about how it can strengthen communities from that perspective, because I think a lot of our listeners or participants today do represent some of those other sectors that have ties to physical activity and recreation. And I'm sure they're all ears to hear how those ties could be achieved. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, speaking of tension, there's a significant amount of tension right now in terms of the financial structure that especially public service recreation providers are faced with, because they continue to want to serve the public while at the same time in whether it's organized or spontaneous and unsupervised activities. And there's costs associated with that. And yet the revenue streams have plummeted, and in fact, maybe non-existent, depending upon which group you're talking with. So I think that presents a number of different challenges, but it also presents some opportunities. So in situations where I've been asked to comment on that, it's a matter of, well, don't think of this as an operating deficit. Think of this as an investment in public health. Again, trying to take advantage of the current understanding that the, especially political arm has told us that they have with respect to the contribution of participation in physical activity, community sport, and so on, into the old, the entire public health realm. So I think I don't have a solution, but it's going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with, and that is a restructuring of the budgeting, of the financial structure of the way these services are actually provided. And I also, talking to a point that was raised earlier, the unprecedented nature of the pressure that was put on outdoor locations did result in some knee-jerk reactions, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of putting price tags on certain things that were free. I know that in one jurisdiction in Ontario, a local lake was getting so much pressure that they had no alternative but to start to charge for parking locally in order to be able to try to cut down on the traffic, which of course caused a great hue and cry. But there are going to be requirements to adjust traditional operating practices and approaches in order to be able to respond to these. And this is not an if, this is an absolute will. It's just a matter of when and how you're going to be able to respond to that while continuing to meet the needs of the public, which, by the way, is ultimately the objective here. So so anyway, that's I think I've exhausted that one.
Thanks, John. Lindsay, do you have something to add?
Yes, thank you. Just quickly, I think I've already sort of given an answer to the two questions, but just picking up on the point about tensions, I think the tensions reflect in part that we haven't sorted out what our values are for initiatives moving forward. And so, I mean, right now, everything is guided by economic growth. That is the basis of all decisions we make, because that's the economic system we're in. So if we can start to think about a system where we do things based on equity and sustainability, for example, so even the current federal government's quality of life framework identifies those two things as cross-cutting lenses. So again, equity and inclusion, and then sustainability, so long-term thinking. That would really sort out a lot of these tensions. And I think an opportunity, just tying it back to COVID-19, I think it's reasonable to think that there will be some sort of a public inquiry around COVID-19. So there was one for our last pandemic 20 years ago with SARS. It was quite heavily focused on the healthcare system. So I think an important opportunity would be for this public inquiry to be intersectoral from the outset, and to start by sorting out what are our goals as a society, what's important to us as a society, and letting that be our guide. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. I see there's one more question, an interesting one that I think we want to tackle, and then after that, we'll maybe conclude with some closing remarks. But it's in the Q&A for the panelists, but I'll just read it out. It'd be interesting to delve into what COVID-19 has informed the sector of, or informed the sector on the culture of movement that supports public behavioral change, and how we may move away from facility dependence for physical activity toward movement built into all of our settings, as we are all sitting here on a Zoom call and nobody has used their stand-up desk yet, I don't think. So I would just put that out to, I actually did, well, one of you was talking to, but I will put that out to all of you, and just if you have any comments on that, and yeah, we'll see where that goes.
Well, I'll just say, I'm standing up, Mike. So, yeah, that individual, their comment is, I'll say hallelujah to that. That's my mantra. And I alluded to this before, if we're, and, I don't want any of my facility recreation colleagues to get nervous about that, but we can't be facility dependent. It's just impossible. And if, this country in rural, more remote areas, if it's solely facility dependent, we're not going to be successful at all. So I think that is something that's come out of COVID. Hopefully that was a message that I was giving.
Awesome. Thanks, John. John, number 2, go ahead.
Yeah, and dovetailing off of that comment, I was on a webinar with a colleague not long ago talking about the likelihood that this is not going to be the last pandemic that we face in our lifetime. And his comment was, I wonder how a mayor of a mid-sized community would respond to the ask for a $50 million capital investment in a facility that's likely going to be closed for 6 to 8 months every 4 or 5 years. And I think that's a pretty pessimistic view, but the point is that it's likely that we're going to be reevaluating the whole variety of things that we've always done and we've always just taken for granted, including the development of recreation facilities, that especially in the way we've always developed them. And to feed off something that was mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of the inquiry, it would be very interesting to look at how this, and again, dovetailing off of something I said a little bit earlier, very interesting how this intersectorally will play out, and to see how, speaking directly to this audience, how policy integration across sectors might help in terms of bringing our sector in line with what others might be doing, for example, in affordable housing or climate change and all those other things that, do have an interplay in things that we're talking about here, but aren't necessarily connected to what we're doing. And so if we can encourage that kind of integration, I think would, number one, we would further our rank in terms of where we stand within the overall system, and secondly, probably get more beneficial results.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Carolyn, go ahead.
I just have one small thing to add to this, because I know a lot of the comments and a lot of our things are based on our knowledge of living in urban centers, where we assume that there's facilities that already exist that for people to access, like when there's not restrictions and things. But I think specifically to this question and a lot of other things is like, these are opportunities to consult with Indigenous communities who have really successful systems that they have come up with, that although they may have a lack of facility, they still have community members getting out and getting active, whether it's meeting at a gravel pit like down the road and they walk a certain route or whatever it is, like these really unstructured opportunities that people have come together as a community and be like, all right, we don't have a rec center, that we can just go to and work out at the gym or whatever the case may be. So what can we do with what we have? So I think in a lot of instances, consulting with Indigenous people and asking for the knowledge in that way is something that we could definitely benefit from. And I know that that's still something that is outside the norms, because in a lot of conversations between, when we talk about systems like government and Indigenous communities, it's always like, how can one group like help the other? And it's always like a very like almost kind of like savior mentality, where it's like this group has a lot of really great established valuable knowledge that isn't always acknowledged and isn't always utilized in opportunities like this, where we can be like, hey, you guys have this figured out. What are you doing that we could do that would be helpful in these situations? So that's just something I wanted to add.
Yeah, excellent. And sharing information is important, and is exactly kind of what we're doing here, and what we'll be doing again on March 8th. Catherine, I'm just going to invite you back on to maybe make a couple closing remarks, and then we'll be able to wrap the session up. So go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, like I've been taking copious notes because that's kind of the mode that I get into. So I'm really glad though that this is recorded, because I will be revisiting the recording to kind of really let everything sink in. But I love how the different kind of dimensions of the discussion happened today, like from big systemic, looking at it, from, up high, and looking at it from like our economic way that our society is structured, and then kind of seeing, glimpses or starting to see movements to perhaps a different way of looking at how to structure government policies and how we kind of support society in this. And I also really enjoyed the concrete examples that were also raised, because I think, like, for me anyway, as a government official, I like having both of those, kind of like, here are the policy drivers. This is kind of what's making us want to go, and here's the data. And then here is some examples of where change is happening, or some different consultations that we as a society or as communities can really kind of come together and benefit on, really speaking to that holistic view of things. The other thing that I want to do, and I don't know if my other government colleagues are thinking the same thing, but I want to revisit the common vision now and kind of reread that policy document based on this conversation, reread the framework for recreation based on this conversation, to kind of see how those policies can kind of support us moving forward. Because I really want, and it would really like to see us keep those documents active and alive, so that we can really rely on them and let that support how we're moving forward. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to March 8th. And as Carolyn said, like, that kind of is looking at a more holistic approach to this issue. So I really thank the organizers of this session for structuring it this way. Is very, very a lot of sense, and thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And again, on behalf of the CPRA organization and the board, thanks for everybody who participated today, all the panelists, John, Lindsay, John, Carolyn, Steve, Catherine. Those of you that asked questions, Claire, Grant, Lucy, Sarah, Amelie, appreciate the interaction, and hope that you all have a chance to digest this, but also go back and maybe watch it again for things that you might have missed. There is going to be a survey that'll be sent out that'll help us in making sure that these sessions kind of hit the mark, and maybe even help us in preparation for March 8th. So I do welcome any kind of input that you can provide through that survey. And I do want to just mention again, or remind you, I've heard it a number of times now, but we are going to have the second installment of the speaker series on March 8th from 12 to 1:45 p.m. Eastern. So those of you that are keeping notes on time and my lack of ability to keep it for this session, we're actually going to build in an extra 15 minutes for the next one. So we'll be on time, hopefully then. But again, appreciate your engagement and involvement, and really truly appreciate the trust that FPT Park has put in CPRA to pull this together, to bring in, you know, our expert partners and members as part of this session and the upcoming one. We appreciate that trust and confidence, and we hope that that we didn't let you down, that this was valuable to all of you, and that the next session will be too. So thanks again. Appreciate everybody's time and hope to see you again on March 8th.
Thanks, everyone.